Hey, it's Amy Shaw here. I want to talk today about shadow. It's something that's been on my mind for several weeks, and I just needed time to really articulate my thoughts about it and, kind of go deeper into that, feel it out, and I just haven't had a lot of time to actually make a video. The other day I was Christmas shopping, and I went to Half Price Bookstore, intent to buy a couple of books for somebody near and dear to my heart. And I came across this, and I thought, this is the perfect book. I'm going to buy this for him. And I brought it home, and I have a little bit of a book addiction. So I brought it home, I thumbed through it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this book, I don't want to get rid of it. I want to keep it. Especially now that I know that this book is actually out of print and is quite expensive. So $10 was a good deal because I can't find it online for anything even close to that. So I'm really glad I bought it. But because I do have a book addiction and I did buy this for somebody else, I am going to let go of this book, but I decided I'm going to read it before I send it on. And so I am just today read this much of it, and it is an amazing book, and it is just rich with information talking about the shadow and all that stuff. So it's right in line with what I wanted to talk about today. So I recommend it. If you can get your hands on this, get this book. It is a gem. I really hope that they reprint it because it is an amazing book. Let me go through it really quick because I do want to read a little bit of what they say the shadow is. So here's what they say. Jung himself, Carl Jung, was the student of Sigmund Freud, and he brought us a very rich psychological understanding. It really is psycho-spiritual, that's really still with us today, and it really melds itself into our understanding of shamanism. A lot of people believe that Jung himself was a shaman. His Red Book was a seminal work. It was just, it's an amazing piece of literature and art, talking all about his journeys, into the spiritual realm and the allies and, all his experiences of that. It's just so, Carl Jung is definitely the modern Western shaman's friend. And I also, before I read this, I want to clarify something too, that when I use the word shaman, I fully understand that this is a specific word from a specific culture and a specific language. But there is a archetype of the shaman, a context, a constellation, a way of where certain aspects of the psyche and the ego and the soul have coalesced and created this imprint, this shamanic imprint. This is cross-cultural. It exists in many, many, many different cultures, even though all these cultures have different names for shaman. So they don't necessarily use the word shaman, but they have the role, and that is a universal aspect. So when I talk about shaman in any of my videos, it's always in the context of the archetype, the universal aspect of it, not the specific word shaman and the specific culture that word came from. I just want to clarify that. We just have adopted that particular word from that particular language to talk about a universal archetype, a universal concept. So now going into the book about shadow, they say Jung himself occasionally identified the shadow with the totality of the unconscious, but most depth psychologists view the shadow as a more or less defined and delineated, although multifaceted, contra-ego of the same sex as the ego. If the ego is a photograph, the shadow is its negative. Standing in direct opposition to the ego, the shadow is an autonomous complex which holds opinions, expresses feelings, and generally wills an agenda radically different from the ego's. Like most autonomous complexes, the shadow results from childhood trauma. I'm not sure that I agree with that. Those qualities of a person's total psyche that are diametrically opposed to the emerging ego, and that the ego rejects because of the pressures of the childhood environment, coalesce in the unconscious. There they form a distinct, conscious, willing entity. Unless reintegrated later in life, they forever seek to sabotage the ego's plans and behaviors. Okay, so they go on and on. That's basically their definition of shadow. I made another video. It's called I Am the Antichrist. If you're interested in this kind of work, I strongly encourage you to look up that video on my channel and watch it. It is long and it is a little heady. That was just information that sort of came through me. You know, and I put it together in a video. It's called I Am the Antichrist. Since making that video, it was well over a year ago now, I'm pretty sure that I made that video. I have read Dispelling Wetiko by Paul Levy, an amazing book, and have been exposed much more to different concepts of the shadow. But that particular video, you know, I talked about the shadow from a much more sort of evolutionary standpoint. And, you know, where we're headed, you know, from an evolutionary standpoint. So, yeah, I urge you, if you're interested in shadow work, you know, and human evolution, to go look up that video and watch it. But for today's purposes, really what I want to talk about is shadow from a shamanic point of view, and why it is so important for a practicing shaman to have done a tremendous amount of shadow work. You know, in a more Native American, you know, cultural tradition, they will call it hollow bone. That the healer must be hollow bone. Basically, what hollow bone means is that cleared out. All the psychological constructs and complexes have been cleared out, so that when the person is actually the shaman is actually doing the work, you know, for the client, they're as clear a channel as can be. Because what happens is when we go into the spiritual realms, even in our dream time, you know, when we're in these spiritual realms, if we're not clear of our shadow, then a lot of what we see is actually projection from ourselves internally. We're projecting it out and then re-experiencing it back into ourselves as if this was a real thing that happened out here. The vast majority of what we experience of other people, how we come to know them, how we come to know, you know, our spirit allies, all of these things really have to do with our own projections. And that's another thing, is that we each do have a spirit language. And so, you know, how the spirits speak to us is not always literal. You know, this is sort of the curse of our rational, materialist Western mind, is we want to make everything literal. So we have this experience of somebody else out here, and we think it's happening out here external to us, and we want to interpret it in a literal sense. But, you know, in actuality, a lot of times that's a faulty way of perceiving and experiencing. Sometimes, you know, the spirits, when they speak in a way that it has to actually be interpreted. But each person is going to have a soul language. And so the spirits will speak to each person in that language. But what I'm getting at is not always literal. I'm getting off track a little bit here because that doesn't really have to do with shadow, but it does, because it's very, very easy to experience things in the spiritual realm and to think that these are external things to us and not understand that they're projections. So we have to clear out as much of our own shadow as possible so that we can be a clear channel, that we're not projecting out here and then trying to say what this is out here is actually pertaining to this client, when that might not necessarily be the case. So it's really, really important. I think it's even more important for the Western shaman to do shadow work, because if you go into like the jungles of, you know, indigenous South America, just say, you know, that's the most popular sort of vision that we have of shamanism today, is the Native Americans, the Native North American Indians, shamans, and then the South American, particularly Peruvian shamans. You know, these, when we think of shamans, most people in our culture tend to think of these two, most predominantly. And I think particularly, say, in, you know, indigenous South America, the shamans there, you know, they have a lineage, they have a cosmology. They don't have words like ego and shadow, and they haven't studied Jung, and they don't study psychology, and their entire culture's different. Their entire culture's very animistic, and isn't built up on this rational materialism like we experience. So we wouldn't go down there and say, well, these shamans in the Amazon, they need to do shadow work, to be able to be effective at what they're doing, because they wouldn't even have a concept of this, right? It is a very Western concept, and for Westerners, this is our lineage. This European alchemy, psychology. This is our shamanic lineage. So here in this country, these are concepts and terms culturally that the shaman must be very adept in, and also I want to say that in our Western culture, a lot of our culture is ran by sorcery. I mean, the sorcery is just astronomical in our culture, actually. So it makes it even more important, I think, for the Western shaman to be aware of that, and that discernment between what's sorcery and what's shamanism, and the different types of magic, and all of that stuff, and all of that comes really up out of shadow. I talked recently about the Yanomamo tribe in South America. I want to bring them up again because I just think it's a really fascinating account, of the shamanic wars. I'm going to link an article as well, an academic article that's coming from an anthropological point of view about the Yanomamo and what they're calling assault shamanism. And so the Yanomamo were using their shamanic powers, their magic, to do revenge killings, of warring tribes, of their infants and their women. I think that that's a really good case in point of why shadow work is so important, because to wield the shamanic power is not something that we should take lightly, or that we should be unconscious or ignorant of. I think certainly, the Yanomamo are people that probably could have benefited from, doing shadow work. And see, that's another thing getting into that, is because a lot of people think that shamans, are on these pedestals, that to call yourself a shaman, to truly be a shaman, you have to be like elevated to this degree of, you can levitate, you can walk on water, you can snap your fingers and instantly heal people, who are on the brink of death, dying of cancer, and that's not really reality. But they also have this perception that the shaman should be like this saintly person that's, like Jesus, always forgiving, and that, they shouldn't have common problems, that they shouldn't experience human emotion in any kind of way, especially the negative emotions. A lot of people, I think, have this erroneous assumption of this is what a shaman is and what they look like, is free of all that stuff. And it's interesting because you go into like these tribes, these tribal shamans who have this strong lineage for centuries and centuries of shamanism, and you'll see, jealousy and envies and, power stealing and wars, shamanic wars happening, and killings and sacrifice. I mean, it's it could be like a mini series, honestly. These people are not without, their human failings. Shamans that will refuse to help people, for different reasons, and, who are prone to alcoholism or, addictions. And I mean, you find this, it's not uncommon, really. So this perception that this shaman should be like this Jesus figure that's altogether perfect is totally erroneous. I don't know where that idea came from, but it does exist. I think in Western culture, we are held to a higher standard for a lot of different reasons, and I don't want to get into all of those. A lot of it's political, a lot of it's cultural, a lot of it's social, a lot of different reasons. Western shamans are held to a higher standard. And I do think, though, that there is some legitimacy to that in terms of the shadow work and clearing out the shadow, just because we don't live in that animistic culture. We don't live in that sort of pure environment where we're connected to the earth, and every day, we're connected to one another, and we have a higher sense of, serving as the community. I mean, we were coming up out of, you know, that very isolated nuclear family model where it's every man for himself and this sort of rugged individualism and all of these things that, you know, Western culture is built on. And so along with that comes a lot of sorcery. And so we have to really, you know, if you go back and watch the video that I was telling you about, the, I Am the Antichrist video, I talk about that, the shadow, and how through our shadow is how these demonic or sorcery or Wetiko forces operate. They work through us and actually puppeteer us in a way. And so you can kind of see the shadow like a hole. It's like a hole. And when you become exposed to it and you clear it out, you can actually plug up the hole. So those forces can't get in anymore. So that's also very important, you know, because there are forces that exist in this world that do seek to devour souls, that seek to destroy and squash spirit and, you know, just tear down. And they do work through people. You know, they're entities outside of us, but they work through our own shadow. So, you know, we have to guard against that. And this is why doing shadow work is so important as a shaman. And I think that anybody who's truly practicing shamanism should have done a significant amount of shadow work. Be very, very familiar with what the shadow is, all the different aspects and facets of the shadow, especially how it, you know, portrays itself in the shamanic archetype, in the constellation. I'll just give you an example. Myself, I'm the wounded healer. I've talked about this in many videos before. A lot of this comes from my initiation as a child, you know, suffering, you know, pretty severe abuse as a child and trauma, you know, the loss of parents, abandonment, all that stuff, a whole ball of just yucky stuff. That made me the wounded healer. Well, we can put this on psychological terms and say, you know, out of that, because I was raised by a narcissistic parent produces either a narcissistic child or a codependent child or a borderline personality child. You know, I went the other way. I went the opposite way. You know, I wasn't allowed to exist as a human being. You know, I was a threat to my narcissistic parents' existence. And so I wasn't allowed to be existing. Nothing about me could be acknowledged, revealed, you know, shared. I couldn't exist. So out of that, I became a codependent. That's one way of sort of describing it. But another way to talk about that is to say that the shadow side of the wounded healer is the martyr, is the savior complex. And, you know, I certainly experienced that. You know, I got married when I was 15 years old to an alcoholic and a drug addict who I was going to save, you know, because I loved him. And, you know, 9 years I struggled in learning about myself and about him and about that whole dynamic. And so that's the shadow side of being the wounded healer. A lot of people like me that have that wounded healer component in their shamanic constellation, we go into the helping professions. It's why I went to school to, you know, study psychology and became a social worker. And so a lot of people like me, they go into nursing, they go into massage therapy, they go into, you know, spiritual professions, the helping professions, because we are the wounded healer types. But see, the shadow side of that is that we can get savior complexes. How the savior complex is actually shadow is because it can be used in sorcery. You know, in shamanic work, to maintain an ethical boundary, I cannot do work on somebody without their permission. The second that I do work on somebody and don't have their permission, I'm actually committing, you know, sorcery. I'm becoming a sorcerer at that moment. You know, so going out and trying to save somebody, you know, we don't really know what their soul path is. And sometimes, you know, although I'm motivated by a desire to decrease pain and suffering in the world, because it comes out of my own pain and suffering, I don't want anybody to have to go through the pain and suffering that I went through. And so that's what motivates me as the wounded healer. But in actuality, like everything that I went through brought me to the point I am today. It was a necessary part of my shamanic initiation and the process of becoming who I am. I wouldn't be the wounded healer without the wounding. So I had to go through the wounding. So asserting yourself over somebody and not allowing them their soul path to be in their wounding is it's a form of sorcery. You know, it's thwarting them on their path. So it's a fine line, really, between you know, assisting people with decreasing their pain and suffering and sort of lording over them and trying to, you know, thwart them from the necessary parts of their path, you know, to get them to the next stage of the lessons that they need to learn, or, you know, the purification that needs to happen. I mean, these are painful things that we go through. So that's just one example of the shadow side. There's so many facets to the shamanic archetype. That's just one facet and one aspect of the shadow. And then there's poles in the shadow as well, which that book that I shared with you also talks about the poles. Really interesting. But this is why it's important to know yourself and to do your shadow work and to clear the shadow, you know, to a degree that not only have you witnessed this aspect of yourself, but that you've actively worked to try to plug up that hole so that you're not unconsciously acting out of this shadow impulse in your practice. So again, this I think illustrates why it is so important for Western shamanic types to do their shadow work if they're going to be in practice and helping other people. Super important. I just want to say this is what I'm going to give a little plug for the School of Modern Soul Science, because it has really helped me, being a student there, to wrap my head around this concept of the shamanic archetype, but the individual facets of it, because I know myself and I can readily identify my facets of how I express, but learning about other facets that I don't necessarily express that other people might have in their shamanic constellation, and then the shadows of that has been very, very, very helpful to me, and I feel like it's really expanded my mind and my understanding of shamanic types and the shadow work that has to occur with that. So anyway, I hope that I was clear. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I've had this on my mind for like I said, several weeks, and I've been really thinking a lot about it. So there's a lot of information going through my head right now, and I hope I touched everything. If you have any questions, comments, as always, you feel free to leave them below the video. Get a hold of me. I'm going to put some links underneath the video in the description that you're free to share, and I welcome discussion about shadow work. So have a great day, you guys. As always, thank you for watching, and I love you so much.